Greetings, dear listeners. A few years ago, LEA Upi, a philosophy professor from Albania who teaches at the London School of Economics, was scrolling through Facebook when she came across a photograph of her grandparents that she had never seen before. Someone had discovered a photograph from their honeymoon and posted it on a public Facebook group. The comments on the photograph ranged from inaccurate to judgmental to just plain mean. Was this husband and wife duo a couple of decadent Albanian aristocrats? Or were they fascist collaborators? Or were they victims of communism? Professor Upi decided to write a book reconstructing her grandparents' story. What makes this book even more compelling is that Professor Upi's grandparents lived through some of the most dramatic moments of the 20th century: the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of fascism in Europe, and World War II. The result is a book titled Indignity, A Life Reimagined, a book which asks, among other things, what does human dignity really mean? Today she joins us to discuss this and other topics in a fascinating episode. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the whole conversation, along with other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and a review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
Leah, I just wanted to say, you and I first met, how many years ago? Was it maybe 2 years ago or so? Now, 3 years ago. Wow, it was 3 years ago. And I had heard tell about this book called Free that you had written. And no, not that one. We'll get to that one. That one, there it is.
It's a beautiful cover, by the way, with a Coke can and the rose.
That's the British cover, isn't it? I think the American cover is different or something like that.
The paperback of the American cover is the same, actually.
Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, I'd heard a lot about this book, and it was very much on my list of things I needed to read. And you know how these things are, like, well, I need to read this. It's well reviewed. It sounds really interesting. And then the way it happened that I ended up reading it is because a colleague asked me to moderate a conversation with you at the Albanian embassy in Washington, D.C. I said, okay, now I have to read it. And I have to say, you read a book to do an interview or an event or something like that, but I was completely bowled over. That book was just so terrific. Not only because I had been working on the Balkans and, for the first time in my life had spent any time in Albania, which again is such a difficult for a foreigner to, like, a society to really get purchase in. It's the language, everything's so different. So I found that book fantastic. And then, we've been talking since then to have you on the podcast. And now there's another terrific book that now is an excuse to and there it is, Indignity, A Life Reimagined by Leah. And well, first, just want to say welcome and say how thrilled I am about that. Just, I guess, to get listeners on the same page before we get into sort of the deeper themes in the book. Give us the book pitch. How did you come to write it? The outlines of the book and what you were trying to do in it. So let's start with that.
Well, so there is a philosophical story, and then there is a kind of contingent story, the empirical story. So the philosophical story is that the book is actually very connected to freedom, to free, and to the themes that free tackles, and in particular the character of my grandmother, which in free is there also to convey a particular way of thinking about freedom and freedom as moral agency. And whenever I talked about the different ideas of freedom in free, often readers, public, suggested that maybe this idea of freedom was an unrealistic one. Some people said it's apolitical because, if someone is free also in a prison, or if freedom is something that we have inside us, then why should anyone care about political freedom? Since it's a moral concept and nobody can take it away, then, what are the implications for the world and for society? And it seemed to lead into kind of political apathy and cynicism. And so I always wanted to somehow address that question and develop this conception of freedom that my grandmother somehow symbolizes in Free. And it's what I sometimes call a Kantian conception of freedom, because it's all about, as I say, the capacity to set and pursue moral ends, to have moral ideas, and to be guided by principles. And that, according to this Immanuel Kant, my favorite philosopher, is what gives dignity to human beings. And my grandmother also somehow symbolized that way also of being dignified, because she was someone who had a very hard life made of ups and downs, and privilege and the loss of privilege, family and the loss of family, and wealth and the loss of wealth. And yet the one thing that she always said that she hang on to throughout her life was dignity. She said that's something that nobody can actually take away from you. So that's the kind of philosophical story, and that's why the concept that the book pursues is dignity. But then there's also a sort of side story, and the contingent reason that brought me to write the book in the way I wrote it was the fact that a photo of her popped up just as I was having these ideas about writing about her, but I didn't quite know how I would write about her and how I would write the story of her life. There was this photograph of her that showed up on the Facebook page of someone I'd never met before, followed by lots of derogatory comments. This was also connected to Free because it was in part connected to the reception of Free in Albania. And so people had posted this photo of her saying, this is the grandmother of the Marxist author who writes about freedom and who has done this book about Albania that was translated in so many languages. And look at this woman, she was a real lady. There she is in the interwar period, somewhere in a very posh location. The photo depicted her in a ski resort wearing a white fur and smiling very glamorously. And her granddaughter is someone who turned out to be an apologist for communism and a Marxist, and so all the usual things that get told about trolls. So for me, the trolling was an interesting incident to start with, and that's how the book starts, with this photograph and with the reconstruction of my effort to tell the story of what is behind the photograph. It's a photo of her that I've never seen before, because I was told that all her records disappeared when her husband went to prison, my grandfather, and the records were confiscated. But a lot of it is about also how does one reconstruct the dignity of someone who has always spoken about dignity and clearly cared a lot about dignity and morality and moral agency, when that person is no longer there to tell their life story. So who is entitled to tell the story of a life when that life is over? And what remains of our dignity when we are no longer there to somehow respond to the trolls, or to respond to the denigrations, or to the indignity of the world? So that's the starting episode, and that's the beginning of the book. And
So
yeah.
I really want to get into a lot of those sort of philosophical concepts as well. But one thing, just a question about the methodology for it. I mean, there's I don't know, it's not exactly a spoiler. It's not that kind of book, but there's sort of a twist at the end, I'd say, that has to do a lot about actually historical facts and how one actually is able to excavate it. Can you say a little bit about the process of doing the research for the book? Because you are in the book doing the research in certain chapters. There's documentary evidence throughout it, but it's interspersed with family history, which, you tell in your own voice. Just tell us a little bit about that. How did you reconstruct the chapters of the family, and your attitude towards it as an author? You're obviously, you're not privy to long dialogues between relatives and things. How do you deal with that?
So basically, that changed in the course of writing the book, and in part as a result of what I was getting from the archive. So when I found this photo on Facebook, it turned out that the original for the photo might be this archive of the former Secret Service in Albania, which holds all the documents concerning people who were surveilled and persecuted by the communist regime. So trial reports of my grandfather, surveillance documents of my grandmother. I was told the photos would be there as well. So I started the book trying to piece together her life by chasing the source of the photograph, which was this archive. and went to the archive, and as one does, filed a request to see this official documentation. And a lot of the book is written in the first person. It's about the narrator, that is to say me, who tries to find the truth of her grandmother's life through a series of visits to not just the Albanian Secret Service, but also a number of other archives, because one story leads to another story. The thing that changed for me as I was writing the book was that the more I went to the archives, the more I began to see that there is only a truth to find if you can be convinced of the mechanism through which the truth is transmitted. So this question of authenticity in the archive, the question of the sincerity of the files, of the objectivity of data, of evidence, that is all things that you can believe in if you can believe the authority that is reconstructing the data for you. And authorities always interpret the data. There's an ordering, there's a ranking, there's things that they say, things that they don't say. And in particular, in the communist archives, it was very clear that often these files were constructed in one way or another, depending very much on who was surveilling and what motivations they had. And so sometimes it was clear that they were over-reporting. They were saying things that just because they needed to say something at the end of the day, they needed to fill the pages and file something. Sometimes they were reporting by saying things that were clearly not true about my grandmother. So things like she was a committed communist and she really loved the party. And I remember reading those documents and thinking, it doesn't sound like my grandmother. And that was because sometimes the spies developed a sympathy with the objects. They called them the objects. And they knew that whatever they wrote in those files were going to affect how they were received, and that would have huge repercussions for these lives. So you begin to see that there is a kind of aesthetics of the archive, and there is a creative intervention in the file. And if you go there with this naive belief that we all have in post-communist countries, that the truth of the file will give us reconciliation with the past injustice, actually, that is, as I say, only works if there is a truth to find, and if you can trust the authority that gives you the truth.
But there was also an amazing part towards the end there that I really just, it's beautiful in a way, but I chuckled because at a certain point, as you're unraveling this and figuring it out, there's you find yourself trying to imbue a sort of almost romantic and human element to these spies and all the craziness that's coming out there.
The Tribune.
And then you're in the Tribune, one of the spies who's keeping tabs on your grandmother. And again, without spoiling the end of it, your interlocutor who's helping you saying, like, come on, it's the communist machine. There's no humanity in this. There's no romance. It's just bureaucratic stupidity and murder at the end of the day.
That's right. Yeah. So this we can say actually. So at some point, I found a death certificate of my grandmother, and I tried to understand, why is there this death certificate from 1953? Because I met my grandmother. I was not born in 1953. I lived a long time with her after the end of the communism and of the Berlin Wall and so on. So what is going on? And one of the potential theories that maybe someone was trying to help her by trying to stop surveillance and insert a fake death certificate, just so that this character could then disappear from the archive and from the file. The archive was not an archive at that point, would disappear from the authorities' site. And of course, I had this idea, and I also had this belief that throughout the research, I didn't want really to find the spies insofar as I thought of them as criminals. But there's something very romantic and very poetic about the idea that there is a good spy who, at the cost of their life, decides to manipulate my grandmother's file so they can save them, so sacrifices themselves for the sake of another person. And it was almost like an exhibition of dignity of the kind that I had been after throughout the book, this heroic act where you don't have to comply with everything, and there is something about human freedom and so on.
That is the plot of a film about another part of the iron of the communist bloc, the lives of others. Where there's the good spy that sort of changes the files for
exactly. So maybe I was sort of led, but basically anyway. So the point is that to go back to the question of the method of the book. Once you give up on this idea that the file, whatever it gives you, it's not going to give you the objective facts around someone's life. You ask yourself the question of another standpoint from which you might be able to reconstruct facts, not with the idea of, what follows from what event, but more with this literary approach, which tries to reconstruct psychological motives and moral principles and sees moral dilemmas in action and sees real characters as they try to grapple with these dilemmas. And so tell a different story of her life, but also of all the other lives that I was coming across in the archive. And so rather than chase the facts of my grandmother's life, With this other method, I thought what you could do was reconstruct the forces, the historical and the political forces that somehow led to the ruin of this life. And so the book then becomes a third-person story that gets told with a novelistic voice, which is a bit like my favorite novels are 19th century novels where you have a third-person narrator that is detached from the characters and tries to reconstruct the motives of each of the characters, and to do so needs to actually inhabit each character equally. So you become every character that you try to represent, and then you have dialogue and you have plot and you have a reconstruction. And there, my idea was that literature gives you a perspective that somehow is, because it's making this effort of having as many voices and as many perspectives as possible, you have a plurality of encounters and a plurality of motives, a plurality of takes on dignity. Somehow there is a higher truth to fiction when it tries to do that and to be as inclusive as possible than the fiction of the archive, which is what I was encountering. So the book plays a lot with form as a way of problematizing the relationship between facts and fictions and standpoints. So the question of what is the perspective from which we can tell as authentic a story as possible about a life that we have no access to.
Before you jump in, Santi, but the question, then is, when you're telling the more literary elements of it. Now, obviously, there's a lot of family history. How did you just give us a little insight on how you reconstructed that? Because again, they're incredibly rich. And that's the other thing, as I was saying, the delight about Free and the delight of this book is actually what a great writer you are. It's very compelling stuff. So just tell us a little bit about that, because I think, if I remember correctly, you got criticized for Free as well because of how vivid those things were. And people are like, well, what is this? Is this a memoir or is this something else? It's obviously clear to me that it's something else, because it's a bigger book than just a family memoir. But talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So in Free, it was a lot of it was a work of memory, but I also, you used, for example, I don't know, children's magazines, or I went and looked at television programs from 1980s. And so I tried to remind myself. With this one, because the memories were just stories, I had to actually go and read the sources that were reconstructing this world. And so actually, I didn't make up anything. Everything I write about Salonika, it actually starts in Constantinople in 1918 with the death of a pasha from overeating baklava, which was a family story that I had been told. And then I was trying to reconstruct, what was a pasha doing? What did 1918 look like if you were in the Ottoman Empire? Of course, at that point, the Ottoman Empire was considered the sick man of Europe. So the pasha is also a symbol for this undignified death of the sick man. So he is a sick man, but he also symbolizes the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But actually, all the detail, all the fictional detail that makes up the narrative, the more novelistic part, is also all based on historical sources. And so it's based on either newspaper clippings or diaries or memoirs of the period, or diplomatic documents or exchanges of letters between people who lived at that point. Sometimes this led to extremely frustrating times of research because, for example, I spent a lot of time researching the leech trade in the Ottoman Empire. And it turned out that I only needed 3 sentences about leeches to reconstruct this character that applied leeches for medical purposes to her stomach, which I also knew as a family history. And, I was looking at why were leeches being traded? Why did the Ottomans use leeches for medical purposes? And when did they go in disuse? And was reading lots of PhD theses about leeches for about 6 months. And then I had to give up because it was not so central to the rest of what I was telling. But basically every single detail, even very, very minor, is actually backed up and reconstructed with the help of historical research. And part of it was also because as I was piecing together my grandmother's life, I came across lots of really interesting lives of other people that were very fragmented. For example, a very important part of the story is the Sephardic Jews of Salonika. And, many of those Jews didn't survive the Holocaust because most of the Jews of Salonika were deported in Auschwitz. But there are fragmented stories. There's letters, there's family histories, there's memoirs of descendants, sometimes people who had known someone. And so I wanted to somehow, with literature, also do justice to the lives of these people who had nobody who could actually tell the story as a descendant or as someone who was a family relative.
Was Dr. Elias real? Was he real or a composite?
So I'm never saying which character was real and which one was not real, but everything I say about him is backed up by documents of
Got it.
Jews of Salonika. That so if I say that the Jews were rounded up on this day and this is what happened on Freedom Square and this is how they transitioned from this is how the Nazi occupation of Salonika worked and these are the different phases of it. That is all based on either memoirs of other Jews or letters or newspapers or exchanges between diplomats who were posted in Salonika and were following the Second World War and so on. So basically, all the story of the, for example, it's another part of the story which is also connected to this question of the dignity of the dead, is the destruction of the Jewish cemetery, which had been throughout the 20s a project of there were all these ambitions to expand the university, and the idea was that the new Greek university needed land for its research labs, and so there was constantly this conflict between the claims of the dead, and so the claims of people who were buried in the cemetery, and the claims of the living for research and for science. And throughout the 20s, there was this pressure to change the location of the cemetery. And of course, it didn't happen, but that was very much the politics. And then it's the Nazis who finished the job and destroyed the cemetery. For all of that, there's a lot of archival research, lots of research by historians, people who have studied this. You can go to the sites, you can read, you can see. And so you get these very vivid images based on, in part, revisiting and in part reading. And but actually very little of it is the work of pure invention. It's a work of imagination. But not very, very little in the book is purely made up.
It's a fascinating book, and it's a fascinating sort of method that you use. It's a fascinating genre. I don't know what to call this book, because it's obviously not a novel. It's of a piece with this new trend in blurring the line between memoir and fiction, like with Nausgaard and people like that. The two words that I want to drill down on more are truth and dignity. And first, truth, because this is something I think our American listeners should make it a bit clear that in a lot of countries, especially in the former communist bloc, where you had one of the most complex, like Byzantine systems of surveillance ever devised, now you can go and look up the archives and see what people were saying about you. And in some countries, especially smaller ones like East Germany or Albania, is a very exhaustive archive. Like a good chunk of the population were informants. And so there's this weird situation where there's a narrative, an official bureaucratic narrative about your grandmother's life that in some ways helps you get closer to the truth, in other ways is a sort of outrage, right? Mm. Then there's this popular narrative that emerges from a photograph and people that have an axe to grind with you and with other people in the elite of Albania or whatever. But then there's the what you're cobbling together, right? And what is it that makes your narrative truer? Or maybe that's not the right question, but that's how I'm going to ask you the question to be provocative here. What is it that makes your narrative truer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in part, the book is a hybrid because I don't claim that my narrative is truer. In many ways, I think of the truth as a process, and I think of it as a very kind of in its very pragmatic philosophical vein, which is truth is what emerges at the end of a process, not something that you start with, but something that you construct little by little. And the more you refine the perspective, the standpoint, the more likely you are to approximate the truth. Not so much as something that is always already given and that we just discover, but more as something that we find by correcting previous mistakes. And so by correcting, and this is also a very familiar idea in philosophy of science, we don't think of the truth now as verification. We think of it more following these falsification methods whereby you approach it as a problem solving, as a type of problem solving. So coming up with the truth is actually coming up with better and better ways of solving the truth, the problems of our time or of previous times as they connect to our time. So for me, in social science and in social research and in history, insofar as we talk about truth, what we're really talking about is this way of approximating a way of thinking about conflicts of the present and the links between the conflicts of the present and the conflicts of the past that is refined and somehow better and tries to learn. And in that sense, the perspective is really important, but it's a question of plurality of perspectives. I don't think there is one standpoint that gives you the truth. It's more about refining the multiple standpoints in such a way that they can all come together and give you this mechanism of approximation to something that maybe will be revealed in the future and that we don't quite know yet. And I think especially in contexts like Albania, but really, I mean, in all contexts that are shaped by traumas and by injustices of the past, this question of standpoint is really crucial, and it's what people really fight over. Whose story are you telling? this is why, and I really understood later why my book Free was so controversial, because I was telling a truth of a child who grew up, as you did in Latin America, I did in Albania, with the eyes of a child who looks at the world with the concerns of a child. And of course, that world from that perspective is what it is, and it's what they tell you it is. But of course, the child's perspective is very different from an adult's perspective. It's very different from someone who grew up, in a rural family, in an urban family, in a particular class situation. So what I did not appreciate when I was writing Free was how much the standpoint was shaping the reception of my books. And so there were people who loved it because they were saying, well, we grew up in the 80s. Nobody has ever told our story in this way. Everyone says the 80s were horrible and we were suffering and we were not eating, but we actually had a great time playing on the streets. And I never thought about freedom. I felt very free, just like you did. And so there was a generational narrative whereby a lot of people were clearly finding convergence. And on the other hand, this very convergence that some groups were finding really made the others so angry, because they thought, how could you possibly have this perspective on this time, which for me was the most traumatic, and I had to queue and I had to do this and I had to, watch my uncle who was spying on me, and I had to watch my neighbor who was spying on me. And this was really a tense anxiety. So in many ways, Indignity is also a reflection on some of these questions that came out from the reception of Free. And that's why it partly starts also with this episode on Facebook and with the trolling. But really, I mean, it's not trolling as me trolling the trolls. It's me really taking seriously the trolls and actually saying, well, maybe the trolls are saying something here, and maybe they do have a perspective on this history and on this time, and on my position, on my grandmother's position, on the link between my position and my grandmother's position. And I need to somehow bring that into the story as well. And that's where I think this is why the hybrid method responds to this, because it tries to have as many perspectives as possible. And so it tries to have, on the one hand, the perspective of the archives that tell their own story of this life. On the other hand, the perspective of the granddaughter who tells another story of the life of her grandmother. And on the other hand, the perspective of a writer who wants to tell a general story about other people who are not connected to her, but are also relevant in the files and are also part of the story, and other lives who she never encountered, but were really important in shaping this life and shaping the social and the historical and the political context. And that's where literature gives you this complementary standpoint. Right. So, I don't think, as I say, just to answer your question, it's not about me claiming that my truth is superior. It's just that my truth makes an effort to correct the exclusions of the archive, and so has a kind of attempts to have a moral integrity that maybe an authority that is just trying to reproduce its own power, it doesn't pose itself a question of its own integrity, because it assumes that it is integrity, it is this system of laws, and nobody is doubting that. The writer somehow challenges that and brings another perspective, and maybe from the combination of these perspectives, the story then continues with the readers who take it and then add their own perspective. And that's why this is, I think, a joint process of search that is ongoing. It doesn't really finish at any point.
Yeah. Okay. So, but there is a second hypothesis, I think, to your work here, which is not just like the effort to correct exclusions, but also to uncover dignity. And in that sense, you are at odds with the trolls, right? That, I'm reconstructing what I read from your book, but it's like you encounter the trolls saying things that offend about your grandmother, and you're saying you don't know the story. So there is a second motivation to your investigation, right? Which is to make the dignity of this life shine forth amid the sort of morass of data about this person. And in the last page of the book, you use the word, you talk about the redemptive power of art, which I think is an interesting idea that doesn't come up before that I can remember, but like just redemption, which is normally a religious idea. And dignity, which is a half religious idea or a pre-modern idea, right? Dignus, how do you reconcile that sort of motivation behind your project with this other idea of truth?
So I think, well, I mean, first on the religion element, I think I have a secularized conception of dignity. You're right that dignity starts with, it actually starts in the Roman world with the concept of dignitas, of status, which is what this death of the pasha somehow tries to tease out in one of the early chapters, which is this idea that we think of dignity as a dignitary, and the role and the official role and the position of someone who carries themselves in a certain way by virtue of the particular social role that they occupy, a leader or a general, or in the Roman world, or a consul, or in this case, in the Ottoman world, a pasha. And then dignity changes its meaning. It becomes more, it has a sort of religious declination where it becomes human beings are imago Dei, so they're in the image of God because they have certain capacities that distinguish them from animals. And so in the order, in the great chain of being, they're at the top because they mirror some ways of thinking about God. And then it becomes more secular basically in the Enlightenment, so in 18th, 19th century, it becomes more and more secular, and it becomes this conception that we connect to agency, to moral agency. And then the question becomes, what do we see of this moral agency in a world that is very much marked by conflict, by injustice, and this was a huge debate during the Enlightenment, because on the one hand, dignity shaped these discussions around humanity, the human being, the aspirations of the human being, which led to the French Revolution, which led to these great transformations, also in the name of secular values in many ways that came out of religious wars and so on. But then on the other hand, also there was a legacy of a number of political processes that were very polarizing and very, themselves unjust, even though they were in the name of these great ideals. And taking kind of roundabout historical excursus before I get to my answer, because it's actually really important. Why is art a way of thinking about dignity, and how does it connect to truth? The book starts with these epigraphs, one from Kant and one from Schiller. So Kant is very much this idea, dignity is in our capacity to set moral ends in a certain way. And then Schiller had this beef with Kant because he was saying, yeah, but how do we bring people to be moral? Who can do that in this world that is, where there's injustice, there's polarization, there's conflict? The French Revolution had just happened, and a lot of people were not very happy with how it was going. This was a time of terror and so on. Where does one find this capacity to reconcile nature with moral imperatives, feelings with these great ideas? And Schiller thought, well, we can't rely on politics because politics is injustice. So if you have an unjust order, that order is not going to give you reconciliation. It's not going to act moral. It's not going to encourage morality. So where do you find that if you can't find it in the political, if you can't find it in society? Where do you find this hope that actually we still have these ideas and we can still somehow we can see them, we can feel them? What is the sensible representation of the idea? And Schiller thought, well, only in the work of art, because it has a certain perspective of reading history, which is a moral perspective, which looks at conflicts and moral dilemmas and discussions between people. That's where we find some kind of aesthetic representation of an ethical ideal. And that's kind of where my book ends with dignity. I don't think that it really reconstructs the dignity of this particular person, or it shows that there was a meaning to this life, because in the end, the meaning of that life depends on what the descendants think of it and do with it, and the legacy of it is open. So yeah, it can have meaning if anyone learns from it or thinks about this story and uses the story in a certain way and relates to it in a certain way, but it has to be the right way. Or it can have no meaning because it can just be trolling and injustice and shaming, and it can change depending on how it's appropriated or misappropriated. And that's why I think the dignity is not about the particular individual and the particular granddaughter who thinks about the dignity of the particular grandmother. It's more about what writing and what a writer can do when it comes to dignity in general and to thinking about humanity in a certain perspective and uncovering this humanity that is in everyone.
Right,
and it's a very...
Your grandmother, though, exhibits freedom and she sets moral ends, even though she's constantly being harassed by history and by so you do depict her as having dignity insofar as you don't depict her as being completely determined by historical forces.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also very hard. So I depict both, actually. And that's, again, something that only literature can do. So if you were to just tell a philosophical story about dignity, you would just show how she tries to do the right thing. And she tries to do the right thing. She resists compromises, But then on the other hand, what you can show from a literary perspective is also the consequences of these principles that she takes. And often they're tragic consequences. They don't go well for her. She doesn't get anything out of it. Certainly doesn't get happiness. But even in terms of, does she get greater morality in the world? It's not clear. It's very open. That all depends on the interpretation of those lives. That an interpretation that it's not just she who shapes it. It's also the writer who reads it and narrates it and talks about this story. So I think, in a way, although, yes, my grandmother has dignity insofar as dignity is the effort, and I show the effort. But if you think about dignity as visible, I don't really know that you actually see it, because what you see is most of the time, that's why the book is called Indignity. Most of the time you see the effort to undermine dignity, and you see the difficulty of upholding that idea of the person when everything else is nationalism, communism, liberalism, fascism, political forces are conjuring up against it. And so, yeah, literature, I think, can show you the effort, but it can also show you the failure.
But say a little bit about free will. And I think that, I mean, maybe this is my own priors come into this. It's one thing that strikes me in the book as you're going through the archives and as you're sort of grappling with this is also the kind of necessity that when you're trying to tell any story, when you're looking at the past, is you recognize how everything's contingent, how everything is embedded in the world in a way, right? Like that, and so I think you're holding on to the idea of free will at the core of this, at the necessity of it. And I believe I was just trying to find the passage. I think it's your grandmother who says, you know, there's that passage you were just referring to. It's like, I was never unfree, she protested. What most people take for freedom is a fact, a sort of slavery to passion, fear, greed, envy. I think we're only free when we try to do the right thing. But that's in tension with the fact that it's all somehow embedded in this sort of very difficult and heavy story of contingencies. Again, without giving away the end, you have this very great rumination about, you know, how you are, who you ended up being. And it's basically contingent on a bunch of things that, you know, were free choices perhaps, but also were conditioned by all sorts of other events that happened. And yet here we are today at this point. So I don't know, you know, obviously free will, or, you know, any concept of the moral or the good requires at least a gesture to the idea of human free will. But it's not that clear to me where you end up in the book that you have a very strong sense of, again, what is human agency? What does it mean to be free? I mean, again, you're back to that sort of question of freedom and the first book. So I don't know, say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely. I think you're completely right. And in part because I think for me, literature problematizes something that I'm committed to philosophically. So I'm committed to the idea that there is free will, because I think insofar as we ascribe responsibility, we assume that there is free will. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to make ascriptions of responsibility. And I think we're always in this debate between, you know, structure and agency. On the one hand, you can say, yes, everything is structure, we're determined. This is also the debate in Free, actually, in the book, where everything is structural, we're determined, we're shaped by forces that are larger than us, we're the result of history. You know, we are born at a particular point in time and at a particular place, and we can't change that. We can't change those facts around. And it's very obvious that all those facts, they make us do certain things in ways that we wouldn't have done if we weren't born in these particular histories. But on the other hand, that can also be, I find, if you place too much emphasis on this argument about structure, that can just let you off the hook one too many things, because then you can just lift your hands and say, well, I'm sorry, you know, this is who I am.
Or there's a flip side to that. It not only it can let you off the hook for doing bad things, but it can also force you to overlook the genuine heroism of people in difficult positions.
Yeah. Which is also why I was so interested in this idea of the good spy, and I wanted to somehow find other heroes, you know, not just my grandmother, who I thought that tries to make these decisions and to not be constantly determined by her history, by her social class, or by her linguistic or cultural position, but actually genuinely thinks of herself as a human that goes beyond some of that. On the other hand, there's the other side is you can go too much the other side. So we can say it's all about agency. Of course we're free. Of course we can determine everything. And that leads into this individualistic empowerment narratives, which I find a bit too kind of naive and shallow and superficial, that are unfortunately very widespread, especially in liberal democratic countries, where you can do anything you like. You know, you can be a good businessman, or you can be a nice person, you can be a woman who fights for, and in the end you realize that actually it doesn't work like that for a lot of people that are genuine constraints. And so it's there, you can somehow overemphasize agency. And I think a lot of my work really is in trying to position itself between those two extremes. On the one hand, the idea that structure determines us. On the other hand, the idea that through agency we can do anything. And I suppose where I'm getting at is especially with Indignity, this sense of connection between the personal and the collective. and not just the collective understood as political and social. So this idea that we are connected in our responsibilities, and so you can't really conceptualize the freedom of one person without thinking about the freedom of the whole, but also connected intergenerationally, so that we can't really think just about our responsibilities in space, but we also have to think about responsibilities in time. And sometimes the meaning of agency, the meaning of free action, becomes a lot clearer if the next generation takes that effort and does something productive with it and use it to see the world in a certain way, or to correct certain mistakes, going back to this idea of truth seeking as resolving the as emerging from the failures, and this process of trial and success. So
But
I
to-
think, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so to build on what Santi's saying, like I said at the beginning, we didn't really discuss what we're going to go, but we did like both zero in on one passage in the book, and I mean this is a good jumping off point to that. It's the question of again, moral choice in different opportunities to sort of do it, and what does end up being the moral choice. And it gets back to this question of dignity, and it's in the debate between your grandfather Aslan and Jafar Bey, his father. And it's this discussion about the decisions that your great grandfather made, political decisions again, but it was the quote that I thought that your grandfather, or at least attributed to him by your great grandfather, attributed to my father, says, for me, dignity is just stopping the fire from spreading. So a very kind of pragmatic approach. And your great grandfather was involved without, again, there's a very rich history, which I very much appreciate because, again, I know it a little bit, but just so good to see it lived. But a very rich history about Albania's, very complicated politics as it goes from Ottoman to a monarchy, and then to occupation, and then finally to communism. He is his
let me read the whole
choices.
quote, because
Yeah, go ahead.
Because it's really good, and this is the part when I was reading this, I was like, this is rising to Dostoevsky. This is very dramatic, world historical, father and son. So the son, Aslan, who is your grandfather, is upset. His father, your great grandfather, it was the what exactly was his title? Prime Minister? I don't know. Of Albania under Italian occupation.
Yeah, he was at that point, he was the head of the Provisional Administrative Committee. So the king had just fled, and you needed to have a Provisional Administrative Committee because the law needs to continue. And so he was the one who was in charge of transferring the crown of Albania, of heading this committee that would legally transfer the crown of Albania from King Zog to Vittorio Emanuele, from to the Italian king. So he was this kind of key figure. Yeah.
So Zafar is collaborating basically with the occupational force, which is a fascist force, and the son is a young sort of democratic socialist, follower of Rousseau, follower of the Enlightenment. So he's confronting his father for the first time for collaborating, and then this is what the father says: the source of the law, the general will, the will of all those beautiful words that captivate you. I haven't got a clue. Laws must be obeyed. Is legality the same thing as legitimacy? I don't know. I'm not interested in philosophical questions. For me, dignity is just stopping the fire from spreading.
And so the question, Leah, is how does one begin to, again, the power of the book is you don't have to, but how should one morally evaluate that? Because I ask that because actually reading your great grandfather's there, I feel a lot of political sympathy for that exact stance. That I think that politics looked at that place, that actually perhaps more badness comes from unfettered idealism rather than a certain kind of like political responsibility, even if the contingency of events ends up incredibly tragic for your family because of his decisions. The entire line of your family, because of the decisions of your great-grandfather, ends up being determined there. And yet, that is an incredibly, I think, just beautifully put and very powerful, and I would say a very moral set of decisions that he made. How to tell us, not even as a philosophy professor, but tell us a little bit personally how you feel about his position there, given everything and the weight of that, and then we can talk philosophically as well.
Well, I mean, it's funny because my mind works the other way. So I sort of think, okay, what is the philosophical method through which you can think about what is the right thing to do in this context? And is that the right method or the wrong method? And I guess as you say, the point of the book is not to say, this is the right view of dignity and that's the wrong view of dignity. It's exactly to have those dialogues. And that's exactly why I think literature is in some ways more effective than philosophy in conveying certain philosophical conversations and certain philosophical ideas, because different readers will resonate with different positions here, so they will actually find their intuitions go one way or another depending on how their philosophical priors. I personally think that he is a consequentialist, so he's thinking about consequences. He's thinking, here I am, I'm in charge of Albania at this point in the middle of the war. What do I do? Do I decide to fight the fascists and to shed a lot of blood? Or do I actually collaborate? Because, as he says at another point in the chapter, even those submarines that we have, Italy has given us submarines, and even the few soldiers that we have, Italy has trained them. But that position makes, as I think Santi said earlier, the moral standpoint impossible. It kind of annihilates it, because it makes the hero look like an idiot. And of course, the interesting thing about heroes is I think we only know they're heroes when they know how the story has ended. When they're in the middle of the history unfolding, we don't know if they're heroes or idiots. They could well be idiots. And so, because they could well be people who lead to these catastrophic outcomes with a huge cost, with huge bloodshed, with lots of victims, or it could go the other way around. This first effort becomes the one that then mobilizes a lot of other people and changes the course of history. This is not something that we can judge. We can judge in the moment, in the middle of the decision moment. We can only judge that if we know how history has ended. So
that's it for part 1, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.